Well, the latest model over who will actually pay for THAAD's deployment in the ROK result in a rethink of whether it gets deployed at all. And today, Monday, is International Workers' Day. We'll be discussing whether the Chinese reputation for putting in long working hours is justified, and if so, why do we do it? I'm Zhong Shi, in for Liu Xin today. Welcome to The Point. White House National Security Chief Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster confirmed that the U.S. would pay for the deployment of Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD system, during a phone call on Sunday with his South Korean counterpart, Kim Kwon-jin. This comes just after Seoul rejected U.S. President Donald Trump's statement that the U.S. would charge South Korea roughly $1 billion for the deployment. And Moon Jae-in, the leading candidate in the country's presidential election, said the deployment of THAAD did not follow a democratic procedure, and the issue must be decided by the next administration. Does the dispute over costs expose possible future conflict points between the U.S. and ROK? Will the results of the presidential election on May 9th change the fate of THAAD? Joining the discussion are Ivan Eland in Washington, D.C., Senior Fellow of the Independent Institute, and Woo Jeon-yup in Seoul, Visiting Fellow of Sejong Institute. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Mr. Eland. Now that McMaster has reassured South Korea that the United States will be paying for THAAD, is that the end of money problems? Could the problem of payment come up again later down the road, considering the Trump administration has called for responsibility sharing and burden sharing with its allies?
Yeah, I think you'll see that again because Trump actually, this was an agreement that had already been reached between South Korea and the United States over the THAAD system, and the president in his remarks seemed to go against that. Now we've known now that he often gets corrected by his staff in one form or another, but I think that's on his mind. And for some good reason. I mean, South Korea has grown rich over the years. We're not in 1950 anymore. The South Koreans have 40%, or excuse me, 40 times the GDP of the North, and they can do more for their defense. They pay about $800 million a year. And also provide infrastructure and land and buy U.S. weapons systems. But if there were war on the Korean Peninsula, they would be really defended mostly by the U.S. because air power and probably troops flooding in. So the U.S. would make great sacrifices to do that. And I think South Korea, in the long term, I think the president's right that South Korea needs to take over more costs for its defense than it's now doing.
Mr. Woo, people who oppose THAAD in South Korea have taken their protests to a new level, haven't they? They are setting in, they are threatening hunger strikes. But just how powerful are those protests in terms of influencing government policies when it comes to the THAAD system?
These days, the protest is undergoing at the site near the THAAD deployment, Seongju area. And the THAAD deployment has been supported by the public opinion in Korea. Like 55% or 60% of Koreans actually support it. But those who live near the THAAD deployment site has been protesting for the deployment of THAAD in their region. But our South Korean government is trying to convince the people in the region that it's going to be safe for them, even if the THAAD is actually deployed in the region, in their neighborhood.
Mr. Wu, what are those protesters trying to achieve here?
Those protests were actually based on some misinformation, firstly, because there was a rumor that THAAD deployment will hurt their crops and their livelihood because of the magnetic pulse coming from the THAAD radar system will cause problems for their crops and the livelihood. So that's the first reason that they started the protest. And second, there are some political reasons that some of the protesters were influenced by the the political groups who oppose the THAAD deployment on Korean Peninsula. So there are two main reasons for the protest.
Well, China has consistently expressed its opposition to the deployment of THAAD in South Korea, and that opposition has reached the stage of exploiting military exercises. Now, before I get to my next question, I want you to listen to this soundbite from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense.
THAAD is damaging the strategic balance and security in the region, and China strongly opposes the deployment of THAAD. The Chinese military will continue to conduct specific exercises and training for real combat, and continue with operational tasks on new weapons and equipment, resolutely safeguarding national security and regional peace and stability.
Strong words, Mr. Wu. How do you interpret this message, and what is the response of South Korea to specific exercises and training for real combat?
We have concerns that the Chinese government and military raise the issues against the THAAD deployment on Korean Peninsula. We believe that the THAAD deployment, even if there has been criticism domestically within South Korea, we believe that THAAD deployment is a countermeasure to go against the threat coming from North Korea, which has been developing its nuclear and missile capabilities against Korea and the US and its allies. So I believe that Chinese will understand eventually that US and Korea's decision to deploy THAAD system in Korean Peninsula will be actually defending Korea from North Korea threat. So it will not pose any threat to China.
Well, both South Korea and the United States have explained this repeatedly, but that doesn't seem to convince China or another major regional power, Russia. Mr. Eland, I want to get your take on the opposition voices to the deployment of a THAAD. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Gennady Gatilov said on Friday that the deployment of THAAD is an additional destabilizing factor in the region. Your take on that concern from Russia?
Well, I think we have the problem with missile defense as being, misperceived. But I think there is the long-range THAAD radar can track intercontinental ballistic missiles before the U.S. missile defense system on the U.S. West Coast can track them. So there is an effect. However, I think it's probably been overstated by both the Russians and the Chinese. I understand their concern because anything that erodes their nuclear deterrent, which this could on the margins, and I say on the margins, could be a problem. But I think China has to realize that North Korea is a problem and they need to do something about it. And one of the reasons that the U.S. is putting the THAAD system in there is because South Korea and other countries, Japan, et cetera, in the region, fear North Korean nuclear weapons and missiles, which they've been testing fairly recently. So there is a cause for it, and I think China probably could work some sort of a deal where THAAD would be removed if they could get the North Korean nuclear program under control. And I think that's what President Trump is trying to do, and I think he's probably right about that because China is the key. China is a major ally of North Korea, and North Korea is sort of running wild right now, and I think China needs to do something to corral. And I realize the Chinese are putting more sanctions on, but I think the United States would like to work some sort of a trade, and Trump has said this point blank. He's a very blunt person. He said we'll work a deal with China if they bring North Korea into the fold on the nuclear weapons and missiles. We'll negotiate with them, and that could include the removal of THAAD.
Mr. Eland, what about China's concern for the surveillance possibilities, for the radar capabilities that come along with the defense capabilities of a THAAD?
Well, that they do have some concern there, as I mentioned. This radar can look deep into China, but it would mainly be useful for tracking intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are the long-range nuclear missiles that China has, and that's the Chinese deterrent, which is very important to China. It's important to other countries as well. And so there is, I think, a legitimate concern on the part of China for that. But I also think that they need to realize that South Korea and Japan are threatened by North Korea's blustering rhetoric and also its nuclear and missile tests. And that's why the THAAD system is being put in there primarily. And it does have that derivative effect of being increased surveillance on China, particularly with nuclear weapons, but that's not the main purpose of it.
Well, Moon Jae-in, the leading candidate in South Korea's upcoming presidential election, has pledged to review the decision to deploy THAAD. And according to the latest Gallup Korea poll, his support has risen to 40%, while his nearest rival, Ahn Cheol-soo's, fell to just 24%. Mr. Woo, if Moon Jae-in wins that election, what could change when it comes to THAAD?
Actually, in current agreement between the U.S. and South Korea, the THAAD deployment has almost like a done deal, because it's not South Korean government buying it from U.S. or it's not South Korean government who installed the THAAD system for Korean forces. It is U.S. forces in Korea which request the deployment THAAD for mainly the defense of the U.S. forces in Korea. So it was U.S. forces' decision to deploy it in the USFK. So even if next government, if the Mr. Moon Jae-in is indeed elected, there is it's not realistic to see that he's going to reverse the decision of that deployment. But if he insists that U.S. has to withdraw its decision to deploy THAAD, there will be some policy and some policy conflict between the U.S. and Korea.
That's all the time we have for this topic. Mr. Ilin and Mr. Woo, thank you so much for your time. Yet again, President Trump appears to have spoken out of turn, this time when telling Reuters that the ROK should pay for the $1 billion THAAD system. In White House, National Security Chief H.R. McMaster had to speak with his counterpart, Kim Kwon-jin, in order to clear up the confusion. The Trump team has been quickly reaching out to allies in Asia over concerns with the DPRK. The focus now seems to be on diplomacy and making a show of a strong, united front. But Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said Friday that all options remain on the table. So we're still getting confused signals from the White House. This in turn is likely to affect the way any future president of the ROK views the THAAD and its deployment. So as the people of the ROK are continually finding out with this administration, a wait-and-see attitude is the best thing everyone can do right now. A lot could change in the next few weeks. You're watching The Point on CGTN. We'll be right back. You're back with The Point. International Workers' Day is celebrated across the world this Monday, May the 1st. In China, a three-day Labor Day holiday has been observed since 1950. This year, about 1/10 of China's population is expected to have traveled over the holiday period, while many others, like me, will have spent the day working. American satirist Mark Twain said in 1872 that a disorderly Chinaman is rare and a lazy one does not exist. He added, quote, "White men often complain of wanting to work, but a Chinaman offers no such complaints. He always manages to find something to do," end of quote. Is China really among one of the most hardworking countries in the world? And conversely, could it really be that sloth and indolence led to the Eurozone crisis? What are the cultural roots of China's hardworking culture, and will it last? Joining me in Beijing is Harvey Zodin, a freelance columnist for China Daily, and Han Hua, a fellow of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University. Thank you for being with us on a public holiday here, to both of you. Now, let me start with you, Harvey. The holiday originally had its roots in the American Midwest, in commemoration, of course, of the Haymarket riots in Chicago, which was marked by, of course, violence, brutality, and deaths. Tell us more about that part of history, and in particular, why, after all of it, the United States doesn't celebrate Labor Day on May 1st. Instead, it celebrates Labor Day on the first Monday in September?
Good questions. You have your May 4th movement, and it's laudatory. We have ours, it's not as laudatory. May 4th, 1886 was a day of protest in America. Protests to try to get the robber barons and capitalist leaders to adopt an 8-hour day, an 8-hour work day. At that time, 10 to 16-hour work days were commonplace. Children worked, and death and injury were their constant companions. So this protest was staged. Unfortunately, a bomb was thrown, people were killed and injured. The next day in nearby Milwaukee, people were killed and injured in another situation of protest. Why don't we celebrate it on May 1st? Well, I think one reason is that Americans don't like communism, don't like socialism, don't like anarchism. And so we tried to take attention off this day. Another reason is that we feared from the beginning, from that time, that if we had a Labor Day to commemorate the events of May 4th, that those events would be repeated every year. And unfortunately, those leaders were partially right, because many people have been killed and injured in many countries on May 1st in protest. And even today, there are protests in America against President Trump, and in France against President Trump's evil twin, Marine Le Pen, who is running for president.
A day that bears historical significance as well as current ones. Now, two kinds of work attitude: work in order to live and live in order to work. What do you think that most Chinese would fall in the first category, that they live to work?
I think nowadays, in reality, Chinese people tend to spend holidays in several status. One is to spend holidays with family, especially the extended family that usually during the work days you don't have time to pay the visit, to spend time with. And the second status is to spend holidays with friends to make up for the soft part from the normal working days when you don't have time to socialize with your friends, to maybe to dig out more opportunities, not only in work but also in social lives. The third category is to keep on working. This is still the normal status for most Chinese people, especially when the Chinese government on the one side to encourage people to spend holidays, to work hard, play hard, but on the other side to encourage the workers by order the institutions, the organizations to pay them the double pay, the triple pay, so that people, especially the making money oriented people, they tend to work during the holidays to get more money. So these are the three major status I observe, for Chinese people to spend their holidays, not only for the May Day holiday, but for other holidays.
Harvey, do you agree? Is that a Chinese thing?
Do I agree with what? Sorry?
Do you agree with what Hua just said over there? Is that a Chinese thing to want to work and to work more and longer hours than, say, the Westerners?
Oh, I think there's several reasons that support what Han Hua said. One is that every Asian tiger has gone through a change from terrible working conditions and long hours to better working conditions and shorter hours as they've gone from a developing to a developed country. Also, I believe that people work hard here in Asia because there's a Confucian background to this, both to support your family, filial piety, and also to honor and support the government. I think also that people here in China, especially where the social safety net is a work in progress, need to work harder and longer at the moment to put away more money for a rainy day.
There is a general reputation. The Chinese do have that reputation for being a very hard-working people. You both mentioned the economic development of the country, the financial incentives, but culturally, where is that reputation coming from? Where is that reputation rooted? Hua?
It's rooted from the Chinese history development. China is an agriculture-based society, and the days traced back to the centuries long before the BC period. That there is this one book called the Shi Jing, or the Book of Songs, have many poems and songs describing how Chinese people, every classes, from the peasants, farmers, all the way up to the noble people, they can't live without hard working. Even for the noble class, noble people, there are many poems and songs describing that the noble people need to work even harder than the peasants and the farmers, because they tend to bear more social responsibilities, and they need to be role models. So this is one example. And also the Confucianism happens the similar period when the books of songs was created. So it's like an interactive process that the Confucian culture also encouraged people to work hard. And also because of the geographic location or position of China in particular, China is surrounded by the plains, by mountains. Only a small part of China, comparatively speaking, only a small part of China is bordered with the ocean. So our natural resources are quite limited. So the products and the productivity can only come from hard work, unlike maybe the Western countries, not to mention US or Canada or those countries, the ocean-oriented cultures. Even for the European continent, there are many natural resources and people can get from the nature. But China, because of its origin from the Changjiang River and the Yellow River, people tend to, and the decoated land area by average
Well, I'm
is
sorry
quite
to cut you off.
limited.
Well, I want to raise some data with both you and Harvey here. Now, according to researchers, the average Chinese worker puts in somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 hours each year, and OECD figures show that workers in Turkey, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and France log in around 1,300 to 1,500 per year. There are at least two questions associated with these data. The first one is that why do the Chinese and people in Asian countries simply work longer hours? And the other is, does working longer hours necessarily mean working harder? Now, you've touched upon the why part, saying how China was it still is an agricultural society and a lack of resources compared to European countries. I want to get Harvey's point on this as well. Why do you think the Chinese and in general people in Asia simply work longer hours? Harvey?
Oh, me? Okay. I think, again, it's part of the Confucian culture. I think people are a little bit insecure here. They need to save for rainy days. Also, I think that it's a matter of status. If you work hard, you advance. If you advance, you gain face. So I think it's very important for people to work hard and to achieve here. And also, as I said before, as societies go from developing societies to developed, the number of hours that people work go down. I'm sure that in the future, Chinese working hours will go down as well.
On that note, Harvey, have you noticed a shift, a change in that mentality that the Chinese work longer hours? Because the younger generation today are very comfortable with a more relaxing lifestyle, and they don't necessarily work as long or as hard as the generation of their parents and their grandparents.
Well, as Hanwha said, work hard, play hard. This is what I always advise my Chinese friends, and I think many of them follow the advice that's the case. And I think that it's very important to have a balanced life and to be able to take advantage of not only your professionalism and work or whatever you do, whether you're a farmer or a worker, but also with your family and friends. So I think it's important to have more variety. And yes, it's absolutely true that young people are choosing different paths. Some of them even work in shared office spaces, and they're trying to invent the next Google or Alibaba, and so attitudes and things are changing.
Hua, do you observe the same thing? Are we losing that tradition? Are the Chinese losing that reputation as hard workers? And if so, should we encourage the young people today to go back to that tradition and to preserve that reputation?
I think this kind of tradition is in our blood, but thanks to the modern technology development, like Harvey said, people have, especially young generation, they have more choices. They can do multi-works at the same time, and they can spend their time more freely, or they can more wisely, but still making money, have a more enjoyable life, to have more socialized time, and to invest and save money. Are still, the questions or the equations they need to balance out.
Harvey Droding and Han Hua joining us tonight for a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much again for being with us on the holiday. And that's it from today's edition of The Point. Our Liu Xin will be back here again tomorrow. In the meantime, you're always welcome to look at our YouTube and Facebook pages. I'm Zhong Shi. Thank you so much for watching.